Good morning. My name is Dave, and today's scripture reading dropped us off in an awkward spot. The disciples are anxious, overwhelmed, and exhausted. Maybe some of you recognize that feeling. We learn that all of this took place after an intense few days of demanding ministry. Mark explains that because so many people were coming and going that they didn't even have a chance to eat, Jesus said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves on a boat to a solitary place. Finally, some peace and quiet by ourselves. Finally, I can put up my feet, put on my PJs, enjoy a drink in front of the TV. We all know how it feels when we've been doing for everyone else, and finally we're ready for some me time. That's about how the disciples were feeling, but not so fast, because many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns to get there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them. Everyone else was so excited about meeting Jesus, but as the crowds kept coming, the disciples must have been muttering under their breath, "Oh, here we go again." So Jesus taught and healed while the disciples helped, until finally it's quitting time. Mark writes, by this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so they can go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. It's over. We're done. Time to go. Everybody's hungry." But Jesus answered, "You give them something to eat." Huh? Us? Do you see how many people are here? Do you see where we are? Where are we supposed to get that much food? And how could we afford it anyway? They said to him, "That would take more than a half year's wages. Are we to go spend that much on bread and give it to them? This is ridiculous." How do you think the disciples felt in that moment? Frustrated? Overwhelmed? Burned out? Unprepared? Maybe a bit annoyed that Jesus would ask for something they didn't have. I bring this up because today we're starting a new sermon series on hospitality called Making Space at the Table. And yet when I mention that we're going to be talking about hospitality, and even more, that I'm going to ask us to practice it, a lot of us have a similar reaction to that of the disciples. Huh? I'm already overworked, overwhelmed, and overcommitted. And now you want me to do more? I know that a lot of us would like to be more hospitable, but we can't, because we don't have the money to buy the right food, or time to cook for people, or the skills to cook anything good enough. We don't have houses or apartments that are big enough, or, if we're honest, clean enough to let anybody see it. And gracious, my roommate can be strange. My children can be embarrassing because sometimes they act like children. I don't want people to see that. Jesus, how am I supposed to host people when I'm already so busy or ill-equipped? The disciples didn't know that Jesus was inviting them into something miraculous. This is one of the few miracles that gets recorded in all four Gospels because it was such a stunning event. And yet, if they'd had it their way, the disciples would have missed it. But I understand feeling inadequate to host people. I grew up in a house with a stay-at-home supermom who was the consummate hostess. We had a spacious home, and almost every night, even when it was just our family, we ate by candlelight. But the table could expand with one leaf or two to welcome even more people, and she had perfectly pressed tablecloths for each of the different sizes. She knew how to cook every course from scratch. She had special china for special occasions and all the extra pieces you might need. A matching gravy boat, butter dish, and butter knife. Special bowls and holders just for corn on the cob. Special glass cups for ice cream sundaes with special long-handled spoons. And individual ramekins for each of the condiments. She decorated the house tastefully for every season, bought fresh flower arrangements, and spent days frantically cleaning the house before guests arrived so that it all looked perfect. Most importantly, she had the social skills to invite people in and make them feel at home with her interesting conversation and her personal charm. I always thought that was normal. That's what hosting is. But after Michelle and I got married right out of college, we discovered that's a lot to live up to. We only had a tiny little table that could barely seat 4 people, and needless to say, we didn't have any special dishes for Sundays or corn on the cob. But the bigger problem was that we had no money. Michelle was student teaching for free, and I was just starting as a youth pastor, so we were barely paying our bills. We wanted to invite people over, but frankly, we were embarrassed. Ramen noodles and pizza left over from last night's youth group were fine for us, but not something we could offer others. Hopefully most of you live in a better place than we did back then, but many of you share our fear of being inadequate to offer proper hospitality. Even if you didn't have a mom like mine, we've all been intimidated by Martha Stewart and Pinterest because they raise hospitality to an art form. People put in hours of preparation into every detail, which may be devoured in seconds. It's entertaining, but a little hard to pull off for normal people who have jobs or families or live on a budget. And this highlights one of the things that gets in the way of us extending the kind of hospitality Jesus calls us to. Many of us have conflated hospitality with entertainment. And it's made us afraid because entertainment gets rated. We imagine people creating their own personal Yelp reviews circulating on MyRock based on the size or cleanliness of our house, the cleverness of our conversation, or the quality of the food. Entertainment doesn't build bridges between people, it builds walls. We want to make sure they don't see the real me, but only the carefully curated me that I want them to see because it's the only one they might like. I want to impress them, but fear I lack the skill or resources to do it. So no wonder many of us hesitate to offer hospitality. Like the disciples, we're not sure we're up to it. So this suggestion feels more like a threat. But all this shows that we, like the disciples, don't understand holy hospitality at all, because it's the opposite of what we see on Pinterest or Living Magazine. For a long time, I wasn't very interested in hospitality. It just seemed like too much work for too little payoff. But reading the scriptures and hearing stories from people who've understood God's hospitality have given me a different vision for it. New excitement that ended up altering the course of my life and has led to transformed relationships with God and with others. So during this series, I want to open those same scriptures with you so that you can find Jesus in places you might never have thought to look. We're going to cover too many verses today for you to catch them all, but they'll all be listed in the High Rock app this week if you want to study them more carefully. The best place to begin is Genesis 18 and 19, which are 2 stories about hospitality that are deliberately juxtaposed to make an important point. In the first story, Abraham looks up and sees 3 men standing nearby. Abraham tended huge herds and lived out in the middle of nowhere, so these guys were obviously far from home and possibly lost. In ancient Near Eastern culture, hospitality was prized, partially because in the desert, it was the only way people could survive. You couldn't just drop into a 7-Eleven for a Slurpee when you're thirsty. It could take days to find water in an unfamiliar place, by which time you'd probably be dead. So a culture of hospitality arose, which Abraham demonstrates wonderfully. Seeing the foreigners in need, Abraham didn't go for his gun, asking why they were trespassing on his property. To the contrary, he invited them to come in and offered them refreshment. You might think Abraham would toss them a water bottle and a few Oreos for the road. It's not like he knows these guys. They're not friends. He has no need to impress them. They're just some random strangers he'll probably never see again. But Abraham's attitude is totally different. He and his wife Sarah served their best fresh bread and killed a precious calf. This is a great example of hospitality, but there's something more happening, which we get a hint of in verse 1. The story begins, "The Lord appeared to Abraham." But then verse 2, Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing by. huh? What's going on here? Is this God or just three dudes? It's not clear. And it gets even more confusing after lunch when one of them inquires about Abraham's wife by name and then makes an oddly intimate prophecy. And notice in verse 10, we read that one of them said, but as the conversation continues in verse 13, we're told, then the Lord said to Abraham, who? Where did he come from? Who are these guys? This is the triune God who appeared to Abraham in the form of some strangers. Abraham tried to give them a gift, but through that interaction, God gave him an even bigger gift. Hold on to that, because next, the Lord decided to test Sodom. So these guys walk down into the town square. They're greeted by Abraham's nephew, Lot, who, like his uncle, has a heart of hospitality. So he invites the strangers to stay the night at his house. No, they answered, we'll spend the night in the square. But Lot knew that they wouldn't be safe there. So he insisted so strongly that they did go with him, and they entered his house. Oh, great, problem solved. But not so fast, because Lot's not so nice neighbors surrounded the house, insisting to have their way with the strangers. You know, there's a narrative about why Sodom was judged that's popular in many churches. But through the prophet Ezekiel, God clearly tells us why. Now, this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. I want you to notice the way that the Lord tested Sodom was to see how they treated strangers. In these stories, by welcoming or rejecting strangers, people are actually welcoming or rejecting God. So people not only followed the Lord by offering hospitality, they found the Lord there too. As they served God by serving others, they found themselves mysteriously being served by God. Who was the host? Who was the guest? It wasn't always clear. And this gets us closer to the heart of hospitality, which we're going to see again and again throughout the scriptures. In Leviticus, the Lord commanded that his people care for strangers. God insisted, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Proverbs promises, a generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed, which is then illustrated in the story about Elijah and the widow in 1 Kings 17. Despite being one meal away from starvation, the widow shared what she had. But because of her sacrificial generosity, God supernaturally supplied enough food to sustain them for months. Moreover, when her son got sick, the Lord used Elijah, the guest, to heal the boy. As with Abraham and Sarah, the widow experienced blessings from God by extending hospitality. There are too many other examples throughout the Old Testament to list them all, but together they point to the importance of and varieties of godly hospitality. Transcending all these examples of human hospitality is God's hospitality, which is a theme that undergirds the entire Bible. This opens with Eden, which the Lord stocked with everything Adam and Eve needed. Significantly, God was providing far more than just a place to live and food to eat. God was offering friendship, talking with Adam and letting himself be known. Another example of God's hospitality is his response to Israel's suffering. The Lord said, I've seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. God cares about those who suffer and responds by getting involved. Every example of God's hospitality here on earth is meant to be a taste of the banquet God promises in eternity, which is tantalizingly described in Isaiah 25:6. On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. This future feast became fuel for Israel's faith. And it's remarkable for its inclusion of all people. Once you have the eyes to see it, it's clear that boundary-breaking hospitality is one of the key themes of the entire Bible. So it's no surprise that we see this same thing when God came to live among us as Jesus. Hospitality was woven into almost every part of Jesus' ministry. His first miracle was turning water into wine to make a party last longer, a hint that Isaiah's banquet was coming closer. And Jesus kept inviting all the wrong people to dinner. He ate with tax collectors, prostitutes, and every kind of sinner. Jesus kept feeding people, including the 5,000 and the 4,000, and miraculously meeting their needs for healing, forgiveness, and reconciliation. In addition, just like Isaiah 25, Jesus frequently described heaven using the metaphor of a great feast to which everyone is invited. In Matthew 22, Jesus declares, "Go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you can find." So the servants went out to the streets and gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. What a different picture of God this is from the one we often have of a cosmic bouncer deciding who can and can't come to the party. Jesus keeps pushing the circle wider. Then Jesus commanded us to have that same counterculturally inclusive spirit of generosity that he did. When you give a luncheon or a dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, so you'll be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they can't repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. In the famous parable of the sheep and the goats, Jesus also affirmed the Old Testament insistence that we'll meet God or miss him in the way we practice hospitality to those in need. Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. So Paul, Peter, and John all commanded us to imitate Jesus' holy hospitality. Paul wrote, "Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality." Apparently, this wasn't an extra. It was an essential part of following and finding Jesus. The author of Hebrews went even further by reminding readers, do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Perhaps the best illustration of the way we mysteriously discover God through hospitality is of two disciples walking to Emmaus who invited an intriguing stranger they met along the way to eat dinner and stay with them for the night. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him. It was only when they ate together that they realized that Jesus was there with them. The final book of the New Testament repeats the description of heaven as a party for all people, including those whom we might not naturally assume would be included. The hospitality we offer others is simply sharing a taste of God's extraordinary hospitality toward us. It's the welcome we didn't deserve because Jesus loves sinners and strangers and invites all of us to the table. We so often think of hospitality as sweet and safe, but I hope you're seeing the subversive nature of God's hospitality. Jesus refused to submit to the systems that separate us. He refused to accept our lines defining who's in and who's out. In fact, every time he saw one of those lines, he kept stepping over to the wrong side. Nowhere was that more obvious than in the story of Jesus' encounter with a leper. Everyone agreed that lepers were contagious and too dangerous to get close to. They made laws to keep them away. But Jesus walked right up to one of them and touched him. Don't miss this. Jesus didn't heal the leper so that he'd be safe to touch. No, Jesus touched the leper first. Then he healed him. But that healing began with the touch that people had claimed would be too dangerous. So, given all of this, how do we define hospitality? It's clearly not to be confused with entertainment or impressing anybody. Jesus never put on a show. Not only did he not own any special corn on the cob holders, he didn't even own a home. And yet his hospitality was extraordinary. So obviously, hospitality is about more than inviting people into your house. It's about inviting people into your heart. It's about making space at the table by stretching our boundaries, defining who's welcome, who is us, and who is them. Hospitality is God's way of challenging our sinful assumptions about others who are different. Holy hospitality changes things, and it changes us. So I don't need corn on the cob holders to become more hospitable. I need to uncover the elitism, racism, laziness, or just plain self-centeredness that makes me more interested in protecting myself than in helping others. Because those sins that seem to be keeping me safe are actually making me miss out on more of God in my life. Because at the core, holy hospitality is not entertainment. It's encountering God by embracing strangers, foreigners, or people in need we usually ignore. Men, it means no longer tolerating misogyny or harassment, even if it doesn't hurt us, so that our sisters can feel safe. White people, it means taking it personally when people of color are excluded or mistreated because they are an us, not a them. Privileged people, it means recognizing that people with less are part of our family. So some of the assets God entrusted to us may not have been intended to be spent on ourselves. But hearing all of this may make you feel like the disciples did when Jesus looked at the hungry crowd of thousands and then instructed, "You give them something to eat." What? How? They said to him, "That would take more than a half year's wages. I'm not sure I'm up to that." But then Jesus asks an important question that many of us need to hear today. Jesus didn't tell them to go earn more money or wait until they'd saved up enough. Jesus asked a simple question. How many loaves do you have? We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Well, obviously that's not enough. I mean, there are thousands of people. Isn't that what we always think? My house isn't that big or that nice. I don't know how to cook or have the time to make something from scratch. My extra bedroom is a mess and it's only an air mattress. I don't know what to say to a stranger. I'll just make it awkward. I can't adopt 11 kids. That's just crazy. We have so many stories we tell ourselves about why reaching out to others will be impossible. But might those just be our excuses that keep us from offering whatever we do have? We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Bring them here to me, he said. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up into heaven, he gave thanks and he broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. It turns out that in Jesus' hands, what they had was more than enough. It's all Jesus needed. So my friends, in that spirit, over the next 6 weeks, we're going to be relearning what hospitality really means from Jesus. And when we're done, we're going to challenge you to follow Jesus by offering whatever you have to bless others. Because I'm convinced you'll encounter Jesus while you're sharing with strangers. But today, I just want to stir your imagination. I want to start you thinking I want you to prepare to hear the way God may call you. Some of us feel like our spiritual lives have grown stale and boring. Ask yourself, when was the last time I followed Jesus out of my comfort zone to extend myself to a stranger? If the answer is, pretty long time, or never, that may be one reason you're so spiritually dry. Do you want to experience more of God in your life? Do you want to see Him at work? Step into God's holy work of hospitality and see if God doesn't meet you there. So often, we think of hospitality as simply inviting people over to dinner. And that's a fine start. Maybe there's a neighbor, classmate, or coworker that you don't know very well whom you could invite to dinner. Not to entertain them, but to enjoy them and let them experience being enjoyed. At work or school, maybe it means inviting that person who usually gets left out to join you and your crew for lunch or into your conversation. Maybe others of you could simply begin by getting to know your neighbors' names. Whether you live in a house or an apartment, I want you to picture in your head right now the 4 closest homes to yours, to the right and to the left, across the hall or across the street. Okay, now I want you to raise your hand if you know the names of the people who live in at least 3 of those 4 houses. Jesus called us to love our neighbors, but few of us even know who they are. So maybe that's the first step. Pro tip, Halloween's around the corner, which is the easiest day of the year to knock on your neighbor's door and introduce yourself. When we moved into our current neighborhood, we used that day to meet every single person on our street, and I wrote down all their names so that Michelle and I could quiz each other on them. Well, that's a start, but maybe God's calling you to something different. Michelle and I never planned to adopt 11 kids. We started simply by inviting a high rocker in need to live in our home for a year. We learned that we didn't need to have everything tidy and clean for our home to be a blessing. It wasn't about the creature comforts. People just wanted someone to care. Then we hosted an international student for a year with no idea where that would lead. Then we took the MAP training from the Department of Children and Families, just in case we ever felt ready to host short-term foster kids someday. Now we have a house that's full to overflowing, and I promise you, Jesus has shown up right in the middle of that joyful chaos. Perhaps you could begin by inviting some folks who can't get to their families for Thanksgiving to come to your house. Or invite a student who will be kicked out of their dorm for a few days to stay with you. Maybe God's calling you to make some new relationships. Invite a coworker or a classmate of a different race or religion to lunch and listen to their experiences. Risk going deeper than talking about the weather or sports. You never know how God might use that to slowly open your eyes to things you haven't seen before, including the way God may be calling you to serve Him by serving people who are strangers to you at the moment. This can be far more potent than we anticipate. The civil rights leaders at lunch counters rightly recognized the subversive power of eating together to break down sinful social structures. Eating together highlights our common need for nourishment and our common humanity. We're more similar than different after all. One simple way to start is by becoming a host family for an international student. We have lots of students in High Rock's ESL classes, including many who've never met a Christian before, who would be thrilled to be invited over for dinner a few times while they're here in the United States. Your goal isn't to convert them, but simply to love them and share with them the other things that you love, which may include your love for God along the way. Perhaps pray beforehand and recognize that Jesus tends to show up when we start loving strangers. Hospitality might look like inviting a non-Christian friend to church so that you can share what you find so special here. Or maybe it's as simple as introducing yourself to someone you don't know at High Rock so that they can feel even more at home here. And you might too. If you're an extrovert, you might talk to 20 people for a minute each. If you're an introvert, you might talk to one person for 20 minutes. But God can use both of those. You may not feel like who you are or what you have to offer is enough. But like in our story, in Jesus' hands, whatever you have can be miraculously adequate.